Hi, this is Paul, and I've got a very special guest today, Neil Shenvi. Neil has a little blog called Neil Shenvi Apologetics, Christian apologetics from a homeschooling theoretical chemist.
That's me.
So that's a very interesting title for a blog. Now we've messaged back and forth a little bit, but we've never spoken before. So let's dive right into it. Tell me a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, when you grew up, what your home life was like, and then maybe towards did you grow up in a Christian family or okay? Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so I was born in California, but I moved to Delaware when I was like 18 months old. So I spent very little time in California as an infant. My dad is an organic chemist, or was before he retired. My mom is a foreign language teacher. But I was not raised in a Christian home. I was kind of spiritual but not religious until I went to college, and I met my future wife, Christina. And through knowing her, we after we graduated from college, we went out to graduate school together back in California, and that's where I became a Christian. Through many different ways, knowing her, going to church with her, and reading a lot of C.S. Lewis. This is a very interesting story there, but yeah, so I became a Christian at graduate school in Berkeley, California, which people think is a miracle in itself. But there's actually a very vibrant Christian community on Berkeley's campus, and so I got plugged into a Bible study there and really grew in my faith there. And that's sort of my very brief biography.
Okay. Well, for you, well, you met a Christian girl. There's a little motivation. What I mean, was Christianity something that you just had never understood before, or did you have problems with it? And what began to make it appealing to you?
Yeah, so I think it had to become unappealing before it became appealing. So I was sort of spiritual. I was very very proud of my intellect. So I kind of had to figure my own things out religiously, philosophically, and I think that was one big obstacle, was that I was very proud of having this free thinking attitude towards religious things. Like I was not gonna just believe things that other people believed. And I knew almost nothing about Christianity. I remember, I think it was my sophomore year at Princeton. I remember this musing on the fact that Christians believed in a Trinity, and I thought to myself, Trinity. Now I'd gone to Catholic church with my mom when I was like young, and so I remember hearing Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. I thought to myself, the Holy Ghost, who's that? So I thought that probably was Jesus when he came back from the dead. He came back as the Holy Ghost, because that was like I was just kind of piecing together from phrases I heard what Christians believed. That shows you, and this is as a sophomore at Princeton. That was my level of awareness, and I thought I was very sophisticated, but clearly I had some basic gaps in my knowledge. So, but like I said, I loved C.S. Lewis. So really funny incident happened to me. I think it was either freshman or sophomore year. There was a then Campus Crusade had a book table in front of our dining hall, and they handed out free books. And I like, who are these guys? And I said, oh, free books? Are you kidding me? Free? I love books. And they were handing out Mere Christianity, the Screw Tape Letters, and I think the Bible. And I was like, I can just have these? And they're like, yeah. And I was like, okay, suckers. And I grabbed the two C.S. Lewis books, and I left the Bible. So I was like, I'm not Bible. I'm not, I read the Bible years ago. And this is, whatever. But I'll take C.S. Lewis. I know this guy. So I read the Screw Tape Letters, without exaggeration, probably like 10 times as a non-Christian. And I could not put it down. I was like, this is so insightful. And at some point, when I met Christina, and I really liked her, I knew she was a Christian. I was like, it would be so much easier for me if Christianity were true and I could believe it. And so I just can't believe it. So it's this weird tension between I knew it would be convenient for it to be true and for me to be a Christian, but then after meeting her, I realized I was not a Christian. And then when we went out to graduate school, I was like, well, I'll meet her sort of halfway. I'll go to church with her. And that's really where I was challenged, that there were people that actually really believe this stuff to be true. In fact, it might be true. And that was troubling to me because I didn't like it. I realized finally, I was like, actually, it's not this sort of like, what does Lewis call it? Milk and water, like soft pedaling, everyone's good and God is nice and he just wants everyone to be happy. No, this is like very serious. There's real spiritual reality. There's heaven and hell. There is sin. There's condemnation. There's a holy God, and there's grace and goodness. But that's it became real to me, and I realized I didn't like that story. I wished it weren't that way. But then the question is, well, but what if it is that way? And if Christianity is true, remember the night I became a Christian, I think, it's hard to tell exactly when I think I was converted, but I think it was the night when I basically came to a place where I said, I don't know. I was talking to God. I was like, I don't know who you are anymore. I thought I knew who you were. I don't know anymore. But if Jesus is your son, I'll follow him. And that was, I think, the moment that I was converted. Right? So it was just the act of saying, I'm lost. I mean, the funny thing is, that's actually sort of the way Jesus describes it, is coming to your senses, turning around, repenting, turning around and saying, I need to be found. And, I know your theological background as a Reformed pastor, but, we do that because God's calling to us. We turn because God is the one turning us. God's calling to us and is making us realize our lost condition. Because before then, I would never have been, I'm lost. But suddenly it came to me like, I don't know the things I thought I knew. And I need someone to show me what's true now. So that's how it became a Christian. I mean, I had a long way to go theologically, obviously. But I got into a small group and a Bible study, and, I came a long way.
So when you say you were spiritual before, what did that look like?
I mean, never going to church, but I kind of, I describe it like this. It was one more category where I could just demonstrate my superiority to other people. I could be smarter. So it was a funny game I would play. I mean, not consciously, but the game I played was, I'm smarter than everyone else. But if I'm not smarter, well, I'm more athletic. If I'm not more athletic, then I'm probably funnier. But if I'm not funnier, then I'd find something that would make me better than them. But being spiritual is like the ultimate trump card, because even if they had all those other things, well, but I have this deeper side. I think Lewis talks about this, how it's this, he's the patient in Great Letters sees himself as this fully orbed human, where he can laugh it up with the worldly sophisticates on Saturday night, but then Sunday he can kneel before the humble and the religious, because he has this deeper side to him. So that was sort of how I viewed spirituality. It's really, and again, I would never have named that at the time, but it was one more category, and really the ultimate category for self-justification. Again, I wouldn't have put it in those terms at the time, but it really was a way where I could feel like I was accomplished and actually better than other people.
So what changed in you with your conversion?
Yeah, I mean, everything. I mean, I think it's not like your personality completely changes, your interests change, but I think I remember one time, it was so funny. I think post-conversion, I think God gives a lot of grace, immediate grace, just to show you that like he's real, that this is a real thing. But I remember, and also because I think the transition is often so sharp sometimes, and so you suddenly go from death to life, and suddenly everything looks different. So I remember in graduate school, I was working with a postdoc, and I made this pretty interesting discovery based on the postdoc's work. So he presented his graduate work, and I looked at it and I said, I noticed something that he hadn't seen. And I showed it to him. And I remember sitting in like the common area of our I'm a theorist, so it was in a laboratory. It was our common room. But I remember showing him the math and showing him how I could derive what he had done in a thesis, but I could derive it sort of from first principles. I remember him getting really angry and looking at me and going, that you've done, you think you're smart. You've done nothing. This is nothing. This is nothing. It is literally, and I think well, on the one hand, I knew that actually it was really interesting what I'd shown. And I knew that he probably was feeling a little bit upset and jealous, whatever. But the funny thing is, at the time, he was yelling at me and calling me like dumb. And I remember thinking to myself, why don't I care? Like, I didn't mind it. I was sitting, and I remember what drove me into that point was pride, intellectual pride, all kinds of pride, feeling that I was the smartest. And to be called an idiot and to have my work disparaged before I was a Christian, and this was like literally maybe a year, would have totally made me get riled up and angry. And how dare I'll show you, or I'd mock him back. But I was sitting there almost like in the out of body experience, thinking, why do I not care anymore? I just took it, and I was like, okay, well, that's fine. But it just struck me so clearly as like something's different, because I'm not reacting like I ought to. And I don't think it's necessarily spooky. I don't want to downplay God's grace, but I think that the gospel, it's just intellectually, well, why didn't I care? Because my identity had changed. Yeah. I didn't need to be the best. Yeah. And so it's not like this magical like grace gun that God zaps you with. It's that God, when you realize God loves me regardless of me proving myself. Yeah. And God, in fact, if you only knew how bad I am and how worthless I am, then the fact that you're giving this mild criticism is nothing in the grand scheme of things. So that just rationally makes a lot of sense. But at the time, I was just puzzled. I was like, I don't understand why I'm not getting more worked up. But yeah, that was one incident, I think, among many. But yeah, obviously, I had a long way to go. Sanctification is a very bumpy process, and so
well, it doesn't end.
Yeah, right.
At least not in this world. So you got a degree in theoretical chemistry. What is that?
So my area of specialization is quantum mechanics, and so in grad school I did quantum computing. And then as a postdoc at Yale and at Duke, I did a variety of projects all involving quantum mechanics. Well, I'm not a computationalist, so I do some programming, but it's mostly pencil and paper stuff. And the analogy I always use, although it's weird because I've never watched the show, but The Big Bang Theory. The physicist.
I never watched it either.
No, I know, but it's right. But I heard people talking about it, they bring like the sort of quantum mechanics concepts into the colloquial part, like Schrodinger's cat, like that kind of. There's a whole episode apparently about Schrodinger's cat. But that's exactly what I was doing. That kind of quantum physics and quantum computation is interestingly it's an application of quantum mechanics at its most bizarre. So it's really weird physics. So it's what Einstein called spooky. Dark, what do you call it? Black magic calculus, I think was his phrase.
Now, your wife was in grad school too. What was she studying?
So she was doing chemical biology, and then in our third year, she decided to go to medical school also. So she finished her PhD, then went to get an MD at Yale, and now she is at UNC on faculty as an emergency medicine physician.
So obviously, your kids are smart.
Yeah.
Kids have a tendency to make you humble.
Yeah. No, we have good kids
though. So you both got degrees, and then she went on to med school, and you supported her through med school. When did you get married in this mix?
We got married after our first year of grad school, so 2002, okay. And then she went to med school in 2005, and she did 5 years because we had our son. She had our son in her fifth year, and then fourth/fifth, and then she went to residency and she had our older daughter and younger daughter in her first and third year residency, and then she had our second son in her fellowship year, I think.
Oh wow!
So she did all of that while pregnant. So it's funny, they called it during her graduation ceremony. They had pictures of her, and they roast the graduates, and so they nicknamed her Fertile Myrtle because literally they had like a month by month shot of her, and she's pregnant in like 70% of the shots.
All right, so you're a homeschooling dad, so you're not currently drawing a paycheck from any place.
Nope. Well, I tutor at our local homeschool co-op, and so it's a small paycheck, but yeah, I basically homeschool.
So what are you teaching?
Well, the co-op is a classical
Okay.
Christian education,
Yeah.
and so I'm doing it's the grammar stage of classical education, so it's really memorization. So I have to teach all of the subjects: geography, Latin grammar, English grammar, history, world history. But the I the the way that homeschool co-op works, it's classical conversations. Um, my job is just to teach them literally like the memory work only. That I'm there to show the parents how to teach, not to teach. I'm there to model what teaching looks like. And again, at the level that I'm supposed to be doing, I'm just giving them the information. And in the later stages of the dialectic and rhetoric stages, they'll ask questions. They'll begin to learn how to think more deeply and critically about these ideas. But from all my job is to do, I was told this very clearly by my director, that just convey the information. So I don't have to learn very much. I'm not a humanities guy, as you can probably guess, not naturally. So when I'm home with my kids, it's all STEM all the time. So it's good that I'm rounded out by this co-op to do other things.
And what are the age ranges of your kids, oldest and youngest?
10, 9, let's see, at least 7, 10, 9, 6, and 4. She has a birthday coming up like in a week, I think. I think she's 6.
Still. Okay. Now my wife and I, we have 5 kids, and we homeschooled them too.
Oh, okay.
And there was a portion when she started homeschooling them, and then she actually went to work, and then I would homeschool them during the day, and then come to my office in late afternoon when she got home from school, and then because as a pastor I could pretty easily shift my hours to evening hours. That wasn't a big deal. A lot of people would find it interesting that you have so much education and such an advanced degree, and you're homeschooling, and you're not even you're doing some grunt work in terms of homeschooling in this co-op in some ways. I mean, you're not sitting on the couch and reading them marvelous books. I'm sure you're doing that too, but you and your wife are pretty busy people, I would imagine.
Well, I mean, busy with homeschooling. It's good because I think it's given me a lot of time to pursue my other interests. My passion for a long time has been apologetics, and so defending the Christian faith with reason and evidence. And so I actually wrote a book about apologetics. That's not published yet, but just all the standard stuff about the reliability of the Bible and the arguments for God's existence, things like that. So that all was made possible, I think, because I have a flexible schedule for homeschooling. I homeschool the kids until like 7:30 to 2:30, but then afternoons and evenings are kind of free for me to do other things, which was not nice in that respect. And homeschooling is fun. Like you really get to push the kids to have great opportunities. I always threaten them, I'm putting you in public school if you don't start working harder, because then they're like, no, because they love homeschool. But I want them to appreciate. I don't think they really fully appreciate how fun and freeing and just the opportunities they have. I mean, I remember I was telling stories about my education, which I had a good school, but I was public schooled all the way through high school and in good schools. But I just remember sitting at my desk, staring at the clock for like an hour. So when is the day where I finished all my homework? I would just stare. I'd like draw clocks on my paper and like make the minute hand, erase the minute hand, draw it in again, erase the minute hand, draw, just like waiting for the day to be over. Whereas my kids, it's like they have no concept of what busy work is. It's all education. It's all tailored to them. Anyway, so it's a cool opportunity for them.
Yeah, but I was amazed. I'm amazed how much time is wasted for children in school with homeschooling. most of my kids jumped into school at various different ages, and initially we just had this concern that somehow they weren't going to be up with the other kids and all that stuff. And as we went through, it was like, that's a ridiculous concern.
Yeah.
And they'd get their work done. They'd have time to read good books. We'd limit screen time and that kind of thing. So we'd have, we'd call it constructive free time, where, if they get a little bored, that's actually good, because then they'll go and look for something that interests them and actually pursue it and learn.
Yeah.
And it's actually a wonderful way to have family life. You can get to take vacations while other kids are in school and go to places. Yeah. I mean, I really recommend homeschooling, at least for those parents that can pull it off.
Yeah.
Now, so what's with your interest in apologetics? How did that start?
So when I was in Berkeley, I remember, I don't know how it started, but I remember a meeting with a guy who was the president of the Atheist Society at Berkeley, the Free Thinkers Club at Berkeley. And I don't remember how I got plugged in with, connected to him, because he was an undergraduate and I was a graduate student. But then remember him saying something like, if there were just like one example of a miracle that just happened clearly in history, I would totally believe in God. And then I said, like, so you're thinking like just one example of a moment when like the laws of physics totally broke down and something inexplicable happened. It's like, yeah, just one. I was like, just one. Yes, absolutely. I'm like, well, what about the Big Bang? He's like, and he goes, and the funny thing is, I had not studied apologetics at all at that point. Nothing. Like, this is not like a carefully. This is just like off the top of my head. I was like, well, wait a minute. I'm a scientist. Like, we don't know what happened. That clearly is outside the realm of science. We have no idea what caused it, whether it was caused, how they even worked. But I remember he was just floored. Like, I remember thinking, is it that easy? Like, I was like, well, no, but I remember thinking, I said to myself, I went home thinking, do people do this? Like, are people not giving people these reasons to believe? And that's a ministry, but like the idea that like there are reasons out there. There are questions that are so good, such good questions, and there are good answers. And so why are people not making these available, basically? So that was the beginning of my interest in apologetics, but I kind of petered out, didn't go right. I kind of read some basic books. I read C.S. Lewis. I read Lee Strobel's Case for Christ. And then the funny thing is, it really began to become a passion in my postdoc at Yale. And I got an email from a high school friend who said, "Oh, are you still a religious or something?" Because I don't remember, he knew I became a Christian, but it's like, "Are you still religious? Because I have a friend who can talk you out of all that nonsense." And he went to Yale. So you guys should connect online. He has a blog. So he'd love to have you talk to him on his blog. So I said, "Oh, okay." So I go to this blog, and the guy was very friendly. But we started kind of posting comments on his blog, and we sort of exchanging thoughts. And the funny thing was, and at one point, he recommended that I read a book. I was like, I think it was like, you should read one book that I recommend, and I'll read one book you recommend. So the book he recommended to like undermine my faith was Robert Price's The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man. And he was like, this book will just completely, utterly destroy your faith. And so for those who don't know, Robert Price is like one of the, like, I think without exaggeration, he's one of the 2 mythicists who believe that Jesus was a myth. He's one of the 2 mythicists in the world with a PhD in the relevant field. And he might be the only one who actually is an academic. The other guy's Richard Carrier. I don't want to say for sure, but like I think that he's certainly one of like he's the best known one. But I remember, so he's like the most reputable Jesus mythicist out there. But I remember reading the book and reading passages aloud to my wife and just giggling because they were so ridiculous. Like, and it was like reading like a 9/11 truth or conspiracy theory, like some like blog written in Comic Sans, with flashing fonts. Like at one point he starts talking about how Samson is actually the sun god because Samson has his hair braided in 7 locks, like the 7 rays of the sun, and Samson's hair is red like the red sun, and but it's just going on and on. And I was like, this is just crazy. And this is the book that recommended to me as like the book, the one, you have one magic bullet to deconvert me, and you recommend this? And so
what book did you recommend?
Oh, so if I had to recommend, so the best, so the funny thing is, I thought, gosh, what was the most challenging book that I read as a Christian that challenged Christianity? It's a little bit silly in retrospect, but I think it's probably The God Delusion. Huh. But in retrospect, it was because it was like literally like the second book I read, an atheist book. But I remember I stayed up until like 3 a.m. reading it. And when it's late at night, you get all just like you're lack of sleep and your emotions. So I remember being like, gosh, this is challenging. And I went to bed, I woke in the morning, it's like, what was challenging again? Like I was like, wait a minute, I got to sleep deprived. Because in retrospect, I was like, when I actually thought back on it and reviewed the book, I was like, this is actually not a very good book. But emotionally, he's a good writer. Dawkins is a good writer. And he says some very like forceful things. But if I had to recommend a good book, like that really I think does a good job of outlining the case for atheism, I feel like I've listened to a lot of William Lane Craig debates, and I always recommend the one against Peter Millikan, the Millikan-Craig debate, because Millikan is a very smart guy, is a very polite academic debate, did a really good job defending skepticism, not atheism. And then in terms of books, gosh, I have a whole
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. What book did you recommend to the other guy? So you read The Shrinking Son of Man. What book did you tell the other guy he should read?
I'm not sure if I did actually recommend a book to him. It might have just been that he had one for me. I'm not sure if we actually exchanged books at the time. I just remember reading. That was how I definitely read Price, and then I think I read Dawkins at his recommendation, and now I have a whole shelf of like I've read. I stopped. It sounds crazy, but like. I haven't read like a Christian book besides the Bible in probably like 4 years. No, that's not fair. No, that's not fair because I have read some Christian books, but like I'd say the books I read now are like 80 to 90% either like non-Christian, atheist, or critical theorists who are not Christians. Because and one of the reasons is because I really want to not live in an echo chamber. So in fact, I've had Thomas Sowell has been recommended to me so many times, and I don't read him. I haven't read him yet, mainly because I suspect that he will simply confirm what I believe, and I don't need that. I don't need someone to tell me what I already believe to be true. I want someone to challenge me with things I don't believe, and then challenge me to say, "Are you sure this is true? Here's some evidence against it." And so again, I will read him. I think it's not really fair. I mean, I think by all accounts, he's actually a good scholar. He makes very strong arguments. He's a brilliant guy. And so it'd really be unfair to not read him simply because I agree with him. But I do try to do my best to not just have a balanced reading list, but actually to intentionally read more people that I disagree with than those I agree with.
So at some point, when did you start your blog?
I had a website. And I got the website like, I want to say like 8 to 10 years ago. But then I migrated it to a blog about 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago. So I just transferred all the files over and it just made it look nice. I learned HTML and CSS for this website. So I was like, I'm going to learn HTML. So it looks just really poor. It looked really poor. And so when I finally just updated it to just a commercial format, it looks prettier now.
Okay.
But the content's mainly the same.
And what's your blog? Now you've done a ton of stuff on critical theory lately, but your blog isn't devoted to critical theory. It's devoted to apologetics. Yeah.
And there are other random things on there too. Whenever I write something interesting, I put it on the blog. So there's stuff on homeschooling, a few articles on homeschooling. There's a my friend Michael's gotten me into like sort of D&D, like not the role, not the D&D, like like tabletop board games basically that involve like wizards and elves and things like those kind of like fantasy, so not the role playing, but like the rolling dice thing. So I put my PhD to good use. I've calculated a bunch of probabilities for like strategies for all these games mathematically. So I wrote an article. So anyway, the blog contains a potpourri, but mainly it's apologetics and then critical theory stuff right now.
Okay, I want to find that. I want to find the game stuff because that sounds like fun. I grew up. I used to play these Avalon Hill strategy games with a friend of mine, and played Dungeons and Dragons and in high school, and I still love. I still love board games.
It's really simple probability theory, like really simple, but like it just people haven't done it before I've got MATLAB on my computer. I'll just crunch these numbers and then put it online for people to if they want to know what's the probability of like these attacks succeeding or blah blah. It's all there. But anyway, just this is my spare time.
Do you think people become Christians because of apologetics? How does that work in your mind?
I mean, one of the things people always say is, well, God, you can't argue someone into the kingdom. And I say, yeah, and you can't preach them in either, and you can't love them in, and you can't, I mean, you're talking to, I'm a Calvinist here, in one sense, we can't do anything to get ourselves into the kingdom, let alone someone else, right? God draws everyone into the kingdom. And what's the answer then? Well, the answer is God uses means. And the means are apologetics, preaching, teaching, acts of service, love, mercy, compassion, martyrdom. And so it's a really bad thing to say, is that God doesn't use X. Well, God uses whatever he feels like, and he has ordained apologetics as one of the many ways to bring people into the kingdom. And so I think that's just a simple answer.
Well, what do you think appeals to you about apologetics? I mean, it's a rather unusual hobby. It's not that unusual, but
I'd say it's a passion, and I think it's appealing for many reasons. On two levels. One, I just think it's our job. I think it's what God has equipped me for, is to think carefully and critically through these questions and to help people help give good answers. That's what I feel like, not to be arrogant, but I feel like in a sense that God's made me for that, in the same way God makes God made Eric Liddell fast. God makes a pot to hold water. God makes certain. It's not that I'm special; it's that God's special, and this is what God's given me to do. So I'm just doing my job. So it's not to exalt myself. It's just to say this is just what I think God put me in this place to do this right now. But intellectually, I would say also, I cannot honestly think of a more intellectually challenging and worthy pursuit than apologetics, because you think about it, to be a really good apologist, you have to have a rudimentary understanding of almost every subject. I mean, you have to understand some history. You have to understand, obviously, critical thinking. You have to understand history. You have to understand a little bit of science. You have to understand, you have to do theology, right? So there's almost, I mean, I'm a STEM guy. If not for apologetics, I would be doing nothing but math and science, and I wouldn't care about humanities. But the fact that I want to be able to defend the faith means that's why I read history, and that's why I get into like critical theory right now. But it's really broadened my horizons. And again, you have to be, you can't do everything, but you have to be conversant in a lot of things way outside your expertise. And I think, again, and you don't position yourself as an expert, but at least you've bothered. And I think that is really an amazing task. So
how on earth did you wind up reading so many books about critical theory?
This becomes interesting. So I'm not sure when it started. So I think around the time when I was at Yale. So maybe when I came to North Carolina. So I don't know, maybe around 2010. I began noticing people kind of drifting theologically. And it was always in what I thought back then was a progressive political direction. So these were Christians, professing evangelical Christians, who sort of began adopting progressive political views. That's how I read it at the time. And now I don't know if you look at my blog and look at my Twitter feed or whatever, like I am not political. I do not talk politics. I have my views on politics. You know, I'm a conservative. I keep it secret, but I do not talk about that very often because, like, again, for me, politics is downstream of theology, and so obviously I think our theology has implications for our politics. But if we're going to talk about anything, it's going to be about the gospel and about theology, and then I kind of am willing to let God sort out where we fall in terms of particular issues. So I'm just apolitical. So when I saw people drifting, when I saw people moving politically progressive, I just thought to myself, oh, they're adopting some new views about politics that I guess I don't agree with, but I don't care. I'm not big into that. You know, I vote in presidential elections, but I'm not, again, that's not my thing. But then I noticed that political drift was accompanied by a theological drift, which I didn't care about. And I saw people that were becoming more and more progressive theologically, to the point where some people even became atheists, and virulent atheists, and would denounce this right-wing evangelical, you know, religious right, blah, blah, blah. When I'm like, you literally, like 5 years ago, you were an evangelical Christian who was, again, politically moderate. But so I couldn't connect the two. I just thought to myself, okay, well, I don't know. They somehow became, I guess they're correlated. I don't know, but I couldn't figure it out. But then as the years went on, and I saw this happening more and more, and I, at the same time, began paying attention more to what's happening in their culture around us, sort of what I think is best described as the woke movement, people getting woke. And again, even at the time, even 3-4 years ago, I wouldn't have described it in that language, but something was off. Something I couldn't put my finger on, which didn't seem quite right. And around that time, a few years ago, I still didn't have a name for it, but I remember that Jordan Peterson took off like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, whatever it was, and I watched a few clips of him. And again, I'm not a huge Peterson fan. Like, I think he's fine. He says some interesting things, and I'm not a fanboy by any means. But I was paying attention to some of the things he was saying about what he was calling postmodern neo-Marxism and all this other stuff, and I, again, not paying attention very clearly. But then I don't know how exactly it happened, but I think a friend of mine who's a Christian from the UK said to watch this video. And in it, Peterson was talking with some other professors about a book that he'd read called Race, Class, and Gender. And the quote, I remember he quoted this book as saying, the idea that, I'm going to quote this because I haven't memorized, the idea that objectivity is best achieved only through rational thought, the specifically Western and masculine idea, one that we will challenge throughout this book. This is Patricia Hill Collins and Anderson's Race, Class, and Gender. It's an anthology. I heard that quote. They were talking about the book, and I was like, I got to read this book. So I went and bought it online. It's 500 pages. It's an anthology of writings on all kinds of subjects, you know, feminism, Marxism, you know, economics, you know, LGBTQ issues, etc. And when I finished the book, I posted on Facebook and said, this is the most important book I've read in years, because it made me realize that people were not, why was there a connection? People were adopting a new worldview. People were adopting this ideology, and it was incompatible with Christianity. And it led to political positions, right, that were progressive. But that's not the problem. The problem lay in the ideas they were embracing. And the symptoms of that were progressive politics, I wouldn't say symptoms. They were expressed in politics, but they went way deeper than that. And that's when I began just voraciously as I could with 4 kids I'm homeschooling. But I began voraciously devouring as many books on critical theory as I could, and trying to understand exactly what people were saying and trying to, you know, educate myself. And then the other thing that happened providentially was that around that time, I met my friend Pat Sawyer, who has a PhD in cultural studies and was writing his dissertation on cultural foundations, which basically is applied critical theory. So we met around that time, and actually we met before that, but I began asking him questions about critical theory because that was his professional expertise. And I remember him saying at the time, this is so funny. I remember him saying, he's like, well, I began saying, I think I'm starting to see this in the church. He's like, what? I said, evangelicals are saying some of these things. And he's like, no way, because there's no way an evangelical Christian could believe these things that I'm, writing my PhD. There's no way. It's so obviously not Christian. And we actually he got not heated, but we had like an actual sort of like disagreement over whether it was, he's like, you can't, there's no way, you're just wrong. And then like 6 months later, he was like, I have to apologize. You were absolutely right. He did not have his finger on the pulse of evangelicalism. And so now we've been collaborating a lot because he's come to see, once I started pointing him to certain sources, he was like, this is absolutely critical theory. Yes, absolutely. And so then we've been collaborating on trying to equip Christians to understand what critical theory is, what's good about it, why it's so attractive to people in our culture and even in the church, and then also, but then why it's so fundamentally antithetical to Christianity. So we don't want to caricature it. We want to present it accurately. But we also want to really caution people that you can't embrace this as a worldview because it's just on so many levels, it's going to undermine some basic convictions you have as a Christian.
Now, when I talk about this with some people, one thing that people will often say to me is, but there are many critical theories out there. Which critical theory are you talking about? So I get that a lot. So what is critical theory, and are there multiple of them? Is there something that they all have in common? What are we talking about here? And why do we even call it critical theory? That's such a, can't they find a better word than critical? That word's already way overused as is theory.
Okay, so here, this is what's it, a headache? All right, but in defense here, imagine someone asking you like, what's wrong with feminism, right? Or tell me what feminism is, like in one sentence, right? Like I just can't, and if you start criticizing feminism and it's clear you're talking about like modern day intersectional feminism, then it's okay. You're talking about not all things could be labeled feminism. You're talking about a subset of it, right? And so, we should try to be specific here and use terminology carefully. But as you'll see in a second, there is no one label being used currently to describe these ideas. There's not one. They are undeniably part of critical theory. But, you could use the hashtag not all critical theorists. Yeah, sure, there are critical theorists out there in the past, 80 years ago, and maybe today that aren't using the term the same way, but I think critical theory is what you're seeing all over the place today. That is critical theory, whether it's comprehensive or critical theory in general. Yeah, okay, you can argue it's not, but let me briefly. Here's the history. Karl Marx is basically the origin point for all critical theory. Everyone agrees that's true. Now, it's not his economics. It's not his ideas about economics or money or capitalism. It's his ideas about power. So he was the first guy to sort of, critical theorists will say that he was the first guy to discuss how power sort of circulates in society to recreate and reproduce systems of oppression and subordination, exploitation, right? He does this with economics. He does this with classes, right? But he's the first guy to say, how does power work at a structural level? Then he had other ideas too, though, like things like false consciousness that were also going to play a really important role in later critical theory. So he was the first critical theorist, but the term was not coined until the Frankfurt School in like 1937. This is a group of German philosophers and sociologists that had developed an institute in Germany, and they coined the term critical theory to describe what they were doing. And they were trying to apply Marx's theories more broadly than just looking at economics. They wanted to see how things like the culture industry or mass media could produce systems of domination and exploitation. So how can those other things, like in our culture, reproduce systems of power?
So you're telling me critical theory comes from white people?
It does. Yeah, white Europeans. It does, definitely.
So it's colonial.
It's colonialism. That's right. Well,
All right.
that's it. So where does it go from there, though? Here's the thing. The Frankfurt School is like the 20s, where they began the 20s and 30s. That's like 80 years ago. So some people think that like the critical theory refers to the Frankfurt, and it can't. There's no problem. If you see critical theory capitalized, capital C, capital T, that usually does refer to the Frankfurt School, right? And their disciples, right? People like Habermas who came later. But then, since that time, critical theories have proliferated. So they've spawned entire disciplines. Like, so Bradley Levinson's book Beyond Critique will list like postmodernism, like Foucault and Derrida, as critical social theorists, right? The critical social theory is a term that's sort of more broadly used to describe all these areas. So second wave feminism is a critical social theory, all of it. Critical race theory is a critical social theory. Queer theory is a critical social theory. So all of those entire disciplines fall under the umbrella heading of critical theory, broadly understood. Because, now why? Is it just, semantic? No. Because all of those disciplines are looking at how power operates to produce systems of domination from which we need to be emancipated. That's the sort of the three. How does power work? How does it reproduce oppression and subordination and exploitation? And how can we free people from those phenomena? And then specifically, though, the subset that I think is prevalent among sort of the woke movement, it's hard to characterize. People label it with different terms. People call it critical race theory a lot. The problem with that term is that it's not just about race, right? Critical theory is about, broadly, can be about gender and sexuality and queerness and the social and postmodernism. So it's brought more than just race. People call it, neo-Marxism. That goes back to Antonio Gramsci writing in the 10s. But it's a weird connection between him and the Frankfurt School because his mentor went and talked to it's complicated. Anyway, the bottom line is the phenomenon we're seeing today is absolutely rooted in critical theory. If you want to call it social justice theory, if you want to call it critical social justice, if you want to call it something else, you can be my guest. I think I call it contemporary critical theory because it is a form of critical theory, and it's the most relevant contemporary form we have today. People go to a campus today. People are not quoting Horkheimer, right? They're not quoting Walter Benjamin. They're quoting people like Robin DiAngelo. They're quoting people like, Eduardo Bonilla Silva. They're quoting people like Ibram X. Kendi, right? The anti-racist movement is in many ways rooted in critical theory. The modern anti-racist movement. So the point is just that I don't want to get hung up on the terms we use, but I think it's really silly to deny this is in any way a form of critical theory.
Okay. So you had the sentence, how power operates to produce systems of domination or oppression to which we need to be emancipated. Yeah. So would you say that that's sort of the kernel of the idea that many of these offshoots have in common?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to summarize it. I mean, Levinson in his book has three sort of core themes, which are like power, oppression, and then like and what was the third one? It's like not power, like it's domination. Sometimes it's the more preferred. Some of the term is used, and then again emancipation, and how these systems of power impact our agency and our our experiences as individuals. Like we're all part of this social. We're all part of this system of social. Well, he wouldn't probably say the domination, but we all have a social location, right? We're all part of society that will inform our experience, right? So where we're situated socially will affect our experiences, our knowledge, how we conceptualize ourselves, things like that. It's part of critical theory.
And why do you think, well, I think I've got a lot of thoughts on this. I don't know if we'll talk about this and get to these, and you can ask, I'll give you a chance to ask me questions too, because I do have a ton of thoughts on this, because I came to this stuff not reading any of your books, but just watching people and listening to people carefully in the church, and began to notice this is new.
Yeah.
There's how my understanding of what the gospel was and how it worked, and I'm watching this, I'm thinking, we're talking about different things here.
Yeah.
There are different goals. But anyway, I've got you on the line. I can think my own thoughts any old time, but I'll give you a chance to pick my brain. So it's very interesting that you saw people who were evangelical Christians getting more progressive politically. And see, my story is that I grew up in a racial reconciliation church in the 60s and 70s. And so my politics had always tracked with the African-American community.
Yeah.
But one thing a lot of people pay very little attention to is that especially older generations of the African-American community are very socially conservative.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They might vote for Democrats for a whole bunch of historical reasons, but how they live their lives and the values that they espouse and all of this has been quite conservative.
Yeah.
Many of them come out of the South, and so they're right connected with white folks in the South in terms of the values that they would espouse. But they'd see things from a very different perspective, obviously, because of the racial history in the United States. And I grew up very much as a part of that story. But I'm curious to probe a little bit more about why you think, and people that were friends of yours, because this isn't conscious. I don't think this is conscious for people.
No.
I think, what I've seen is that people, often because of a lot of anti-racism programs that have been going on for quite a while, because my father, was very much a hand in getting that stuff going in the 60s and 70s. People become, especially white people, become aware of what life looks like if you're Black in this country. And, obviously, Christians would be concerned about this and the injustices that many people have suffered from, are increasingly more aware of the subtleties of racism, that if you're white, you don't usually see it because it's not directed towards you often. But if you're Black, it's a very present thing. There are places you don't go. There are things you don't do. There are places you stay, things you don't say. I mean, all of this stuff you learn to live with as a certain, because of a certain history and in a certain place. So people then, you see their political transformation, let's call it, from probably more conservative, let's say if they grew up in a church in a conservative community, and then you begin to notice something else is going on. What do you think's happening? I mean, do you have any ideas psychologically, maybe sociologically, what's happening with people there?
Well, so I don't like to speculate about motives, and sort of interestingly, that is very much a part of critical theory. This sort of postmodern approach to the sociology of knowledge, where you say, well, here's why you believe that. Well, that's a very dangerous game to play, because let's figure out whether the beliefs are true first, and then we'll figure out why people might believe those things. But I really, because I'm wary of that whole line of, C.S. Lewis called it bulverism, avoiding the truth and focusing on motives. Let's focus on the truth claims themselves. I will just say that I think there is a sociological component. So people do get involved in these groups that they share certain values in common, and oftentimes the values will be a certain set of political values, either right-wing or left-wing, and then that will form a community that gives you social feedback, positive feedback, and then you'll start embracing their other ideas as well. So if you find yourself in any community, right, wing or left wing, it sort of mutually reinforces their that sort of groupthink. And for better or worse, I mean, you can get involved in good communities that are, I think, promoting biblical values. So I think there's an aspect of that, but I think I'd like to focus on just the ideological aspect, where what's happening is people, like you said, will subconsciously begin absorbing these ideas without knowing they are. For example, this is a classic example. This applies to me. So when I gave talks on critical theory, I have a section I devote to racism, and to racism in the U.S. today, racial disparities, racial advantages that exist today based on data, experiments, sociology. So it's not speculative, it's data. But when I first gave that talk, I talked about white privilege. And now I defined that term to mean the unearned advantages that whites have over blacks or people of color as a whole, on average, in general. So, and then I supported that, I defined it that way, and then I supported the claim that they do have this privilege using data, using studies, using all these different factors, okay? But here's the thing. So I use that term. Now, I had an inkling of the fact that I should be careful, which is why I define it so carefully. However, I eventually stopped using the term. And here's why. Because when I looked really carefully at Peggy McIntosh's paper, Peggy McIntosh popularized the phrase white privilege in like 88? And a paper called like Unpacking the Knapsack. Anyway, when she defined that term, she did not define it the way that I was defining it. In her definition, white privilege, it's this huge term that encompasses all kinds of different things. They're immoral, amoral, and they're completely heterogeneous. So, for example, she would put things like, you have white privilege because you don't get followed around in a store and accused of stealing things, right? That's a form of privilege, okay? And then she'd also on the same list say, and you can find a Band-Aid whose color matches your skin tone. That's also white privilege. Now, here's the problem. One of those things is due to sin. One of those things is not. In a perfect sinless world, I don't think that we're going to have Band-Aids that literally have every hue, color on the rainbow. And more than that, white people are in the majority in this country. So businesses are going to have to pick a color for their Band-Aids and sort of pick the one that happens to match most people. So the point is, like, that's not a sinful thing. It might be annoying. I get that, right? But it's not like it's this evil, wicked system we have to overthrow it. So that's one thing. Is she conflates these very different categories. She also talks about how privilege is invisible. It's transparent. You can't see it because you're socialized into this system of white supremacy, so you're blind to it. And you have to defer to the voices of the oppressed people of color. And she actually compares it to how men can't see their male privilege because she's a feminist. So the point is, so her term, white privilege, is embedded in this entire way of thinking, this entire ideology. And when I realized that, I said, I can't use this term anymore. I'll use a different one. I'll use unearned advantages. That's fine. But the term was being embedded in this entire, essentially, this worldview. What's happening today is people are picking up these terms, these phrases like intersectionality, white privilege, white fragility, colorblind racism, things like that, or structural racism. They'll hear these phrases, they kind of have a sense of what they might mean, or they interpret them through their Christian worldview. They say, oh, I know what that must mean. They use those terms, and they hear other people using those terms. They think they're meaning the same thing, and after like months, years, subconsciously, these ideas begin to work their way into how they start thinking. They don't realize it, but the way they're using these words constantly begins to change, and they begin to take on the actual meaning of the terms, right? Like, example I always use, take the phrase reproductive justice, right? I might hear that phrase, and I might define that phrase to mean the right of a woman to have children if she wants to have children. That's reproductive justice, reproductive freedom, right? That's what I mean by that term, right? But if I start using that term all the time, or if I'm a pastor and I use that term all the time, And there are these people in my congregation sitting around me hearing that term I'm talking about Christians should stand up for reproductive justice and reproductive and freedom, women's rights. I keep saying those terms and not defining them. My congregation is at best going to be confused, and at worst, they're going to be like, oh, I heard that term. Who used that term? Oh, yeah, Planned Parenthood used that term. It must mean the same thing. And what will happen is you'll get this slow, gradual drift where people begin imbibing these ideas through the language that's being used and not even realizing the foundational beliefs that undergird these ideas, this language. So that's what I see happening a lot. And then, of course, you have these social groups that form around causes like anti-racism that I think because they're united around a cause, they do combine people with very different theological beliefs. And so you have this tug towards the mean, right? You have some average. And if you have people that are conservative theologically and people that are progressive theologically, well, they're going to both regress to the mean a little bit. And so you're going to have the conservatives being pulled, again, theologically I'm talking about, being pulled towards the progressive end. So that's sort of like just general reasoning, but I would say even more deeply, these ideas really are poisonous in the sense that if you adopt them, they tend to spread out. It's like putting a drop of ink in a glass of water, right? They start small, but then you begin to expand. So an example I would use is an idea, this is actually, it's from postmodernism, but contemporary critical theory draws very heavily on postmodernism. And it's ideas about truth and power. So a classic example, I just wrote on it today, actually. You saw the essay. Critical race theory, one of their core themes is that claims of neutrality and objectivity and universality actually hide the goals and the agendas of the ruling class. So we say, well, why should, this is actually a real example. When you say, why shouldn't so-and-so go to this school for college? And you say, their SAT scores aren't high enough. But people will say, that seems objective and neutral. But then critical race theorists and other people, but they'll say, wait a minute, that standard itself is rigged because you created that test in order to keep blacks out. And then you appeal to the test as an objective measure of who can go to college. Now, that's what they'll say. I'm not saying that's correct, but they will deconstruct these claims of objectivity and neutrality and the rule of law and rights. They'll say those are really disguises that hide the self-interest of the ruling class. They're used to justify unjust power arrangements. Okay. Now, here's the thing. When it comes to race in history, that's, I think, pretty reasonable, right? And there are examples of Supreme Court cases where companies would appeal to objective rules that they created with the express intent of discriminating against blacks without saying it, right? So the famous examples is Duke Energy. There's a Supreme Court case, Griggs versus Duke Energy, where Duke Energy created a test for hiring that hadn't existed before. They created it like a year after the Civil Rights Act was passed. And suddenly, lo and behold, there's a new test you have to pass, and lo and behold, only whites could pass it. So lo and behold, they have only whites working these jobs. And the Supreme Court was like, you can't do that. That's clearly, you're trying to keep blacks out. That's racism, and you can't do it. So that's a completely legitimate use of questioning these supposedly neutral standards. That's a real example. I think everyone would say that's fair. Here's the problem. Let's say you accept that reasoning not as a sort of conclusion based on evidence, but as an assumption, as a presupposition. And it happens subtly. But now you begin to say, every time someone appeals to objectivity or neutrality, I'm going to probe and try to unearth the real motivations for that claim, the real power play behind the truth claim. This is Foucault. So you start doing it with race. you claim to be appealing to the SAT, but really the SAT was created to, create social stratified classes in the US, and so we're going to now dismantle the SAT. Okay, but you say, well, that might be fine. Well, what about doing that with things like gender claims? What about the Bible? The Bible says that only men should be pastors and elders. Oh, you say the Bible says that objectively, but that's just your way of maintaining your power and privilege. What about the Bible says homosexuality is a sin? Oh, you say that that's your interpretation of the Bible, that's your objective interpretation, but really that's a power play to, reify your heterosexual privilege. So the point is, you can embrace these ideas narrowly, but how long before you begin implying them broadly? How long before you start deconstructing not just, say, racial laws or racial history, but gender and sexuality and religious exclusivity, and name the problem? This is the creep of postmodern thinking that is so deleterious to everything, frankly. That is just one example of how some of these basic principles can spread from a narrow application to a much broader, ideology or framework.
Is there, you don't have to watch this for too long to appreciate the fact that, and C.S. Lewis actually talked about this in a number of ways in different, this solvent burns through everything.
Yeah, it's corrosive.
Whereas, you can say, well, the people that created the SAT, they might not even, they maybe weren't even intentionally trying to exclude these other people, but it is in fact so built into them, they're running that program whether they know it or not. And of course, right, once you turn that solvent back towards the people who are employing it, you don't need to be that smart to say, oh, you're just making this point to so on and so forth.
No, that's the trick though. So here's the thing. So Helen Pluckrose calls critical theory, or this, whatever you want to call this movement, she calls it applied postmodernism, which is okay. You can see how there's a lot of postmodern thinking, like Foucault and Derrida are very influential in this way of thinking. But here's the problem. Critical theory, or whatever you want to call it, contemporary critical theory, is not purely postmodernist. Why? Because, and they'll say this explicitly, so Patricia Hill Collins in her recent book, Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory, she critiques the postmodernists because their project is purely deconstructive. They want to dismantle everything. And she says critical theory can't do that. Critical theory has to be self-reflexive. We have to, she interprets that term reflexivity to mean we have to step back at every point and say, is our deconstruction, is it working for social justice or not? If a system is standing in the way of social justice, then we deconstruct it. But if a system is not standing in the way of social justice, we do not apply this universal solvent to it. So this is the trick. What do you say if you say to a critical theorist, wait a minute. What you're doing is you're accusing me of, making a bid for power, but you yourself are making a bid for power. By doing that, you're trying to get people to ignore me and follow you. So why can't you be, critiqued in the same way? What they can say is, because I am working for social justice. So and here's the thing, we didn't talk about this yet. Within critical theory, there's an asymmetry built into critical theory between oppressors and oppressed. Oppressor groups, like socially dominant groups, that's men, whites, heterosexuals, the rich, citizens, and then subordinate groups would be women, the poor, people of color, immigrants, the poor. So there's a social binary, and people in the dominant oppressor groups tend to be blinded by their privilege, whereas people in subordinate oppressed groups tend to have what's called a double consciousness. They have they have access to the truth through their lived experience that is unavailable or less available to oppressors. So because of that, the critical theorist can say, what we're doing is not a power play because we're working for social justice when you're not. And two, we have and we have through our lived experience, we have access to these truths about oppression that you're blinded to, right? So you can't play the game with them because they'll say, well, no, but we're coming from a position of epistemic authority because we are part, or either we're part of these groups ourselves, or we are listening to them. So even if you're a white male, or old white male, right? But if you're an ally to oppress people, then you can speak for them and then say that, well, I'm telling you what this perspective is, and because I've sat at the feet of, and I'm deferring to their authority, therefore I can make this pronouncement, I can discern that you are still captivated by this ideology that's been informed by oppression and subjugation and the ruling class's ideology. It's called a hegemonic discourse. They can see through it, but you can't. So the point is, you can't play the sort of jujitsu trick that that people like Tim Keller love to do. Tim Keller will point out, Nietzsche says all truth claims are power plays. Well, so is that. But you can't play that with critical theorists because they will say, well, this is not because we're relying on the epistemic authority of oppressed groups and we're working for justice and you are not. That's a differentiation between me and you.
And what do they say is social justice and how can it be known?
This is fascinating. So again, in Collins's recent book, she actually says all about, we have to constantly be evaluating whether our projects work for social justice. And then she says, now granted, it's really hard to define what social justice is. This is amazing, right? But she says that in her book. But it's not uncommon that these books, like there's a book, another anthology called Readings for Diversity and Social Justice, right? They use that term social justice like dozens of times, right? It's in the title. They don't define, no one defines that term until page 483, right? That's the first time the term is defined. So the point is they're using this term all the time and they assume that everyone knows what it means. That when one author finally defines it, she says that social justice is the elimination of all forms of social oppression, where oppression is defined in terms of, again, this hegemonic power. Who is imposing their ideology on other groups? Who's the ruling class? It's the whites, men, heterosexuals, the rich. They're imposing certain norms and values on culture, and that imposition is oppressive, and we have to undermine and dismantle those oppressive norms and ideologies. And when we do, once we achieve a state where everyone has shared power, then we've achieved a state of equity, which is social justice.
So at that point, it begins to look again more like traditional Marxism in terms of their long evolution that even the state will dissolve because everyone will share the means of production, but this is a distant transformation of that.
So the funny thing is that one frustrating thing about contemporary critical theorists is that they're very practical, and this is actually maybe it's built into critical theory since its inception, is that they focus on what's called imminent critique, meaning like critique of things as they are right now in their historical contingency. So they're not talking about, they don't set up systems of like analytical theories and ways to analyze what is good and just for all time. Not into that. They're saying what is imminently, practically the thing to do right now. What does our society look like right now? How did it come to be, and how can we transform it for the good? Not trying to lay out these universalizing theories. So you ask them, what's the end game? I think you don't come across that very often. They will generally say things like, well, we want to achieve a state of equity, but exactly how that will look, they're not like Marx. They're not like, oh, one day we'll achieve a classless society. They don't say that. They're just saying one day we'll achieve a state of equity that looks like power being shared, but they're not going to lay down, here's how we know it's happening. Here's how, they don't really say that very often. So there's not some deep universal theoretical perspective on what justice is. They're saying, here's what we ought to do in terms of race or gender without prescribing. I mean, as a Christian, it's kind of frustrating because you're like, well, gender means something. What does it mean? And they say, well, gender means something. We would say transcendently, gender is a transcendent category, right? It's an essential category. whereas they would actually probably deny that completely, but they would also say gender is socially constructed, and the process by which gender was socially constructed is historical. It's bound to our current 21st century American context. So we can't make these crazy essentializing statements about what male and female are across all. That's, what is that, Christianity? Well, that's, yeah. But they don't make those kind of claims.
Have you read any, there's a sociologist, I think he's at Notre Dame right now, Christian Smith.
I've heard of him, but I haven't read him.
He wrote a book in the 90s called Soul Searching, where he interviewed teens and youth from across the religious spectrum to try to discern, what do they think? Are children of Baptists? Do they have Baptist moral sensitivities? And they tried to figure out religious and moral sensitivities from people. And it was from this work that the much more popular term moralistic therapeutic deism came from.
That's how I know him, yeah.
Because what he discovered was that across the board, it didn't matter if kids were raised by atheists, by Baptists, by Mormons, by Muslims, by Presbyterians. It didn't matter. All of these children basically had the same intuitive moral framework. And one of the elements of this moral framework was that morality is fundamentally self-evident. Now, this obviously, if someone like you hears that, you begin to say, well, if that's true, why are there so many different competing and moralities that can't get along and agree with each other? But that doesn't happen because, in a sense, moral intuitions are unquestionable because they're also ironically historical for these children. And now, obviously, these children that he interviewed in the 90s are, in fact, well into adulthood today. And the likelihood that their fundamental orientations with respect to these ideas are unchanged is quite low. So it's that's very interesting to me, that Imminent Critique. I'll tell a little bit of, so I began to watch, so in the Christian Reformed Church, there was a huge fight in the 70s, 80s, and 90s about whether or not women should serve in church office.
Sure.
And the Christian Reformed Church ended that feud with a political compromise that basically said, we'll leave it up to each local congregation, and then different classes, which are the regional bodies, if a classis votes to seat women elders and pastors at their classis, they may do so. And once a majority of classes have, allow this, then synod will seat women office bearers, and so on and so forth. And watch that whole thing go through. And then, of course, in the last 10, 15 years, during that time, there were, many, many calls that, some people, because the Christian Reformed Church always, at least at that point, was always sort of looking to the Netherlands, had seen things happen in the Netherlands, are saying, first it's going to be women, then it's going to be gays. And of course, in the end of the 20th century, no, that'll never happen. It's totally different dynamic. And then, of course, the Christian Reformed Church, along with many other denominations, are having the conversations about LGBT.
Sure.
And so I was sort of expecting things to line up as they did with the women in church office fight, where they're going to have battles about certain Bible verses. And the way the Christian Reformed Church ended the debate was they said, well, you can make a case, a theological case, for permitting it and for restricting it. So Christians, it's adiaphoric. Christians can go either way.
Sure.
Now, it's far more difficult to make that argument with respect to the LGBT issues.
Yeah.
And so I was just watching this develop in the mid-teens, and I was listening carefully to the argument, and I began to notice the arguments for inclusion began to take on a different tone. And I was looking at this in the context of the rest of society, and I basically came up with the term progressive liberationism, which, because when I was listening, I was saying, it seems to be what God is most interested in is that I am freed from constraints that bind, and then I came up with this term, the secret sacred self. There's a secret sacred self deep within me. This
Yeah.
is somehow disconnected from my historical person,
Yeah.
and I can get in touch with this secret sacred self by, basically listening to my feelings, in sort of a Star Wars way. And then once I discover who that secret sacred self is, it is therefore God's job to allow me via history to manifest this in my life, and therefore finally to realize, I began noticing, to realize my destiny. I began noticing you had an entire path towards redemption. But this entire path towards redemption bore very little similarity to traditional theology that talked about sin, that had things like mortification, self-denial, so on and so forth. And I began to watch this and began to think, well, this is very interesting, and then began to see how this new gospel of progressive liberationism was, the Bible was then being reinterpreted in these terms. And that's when I began to, and of course later in the teens, the woke stuff began to emerge. And I began, and I was also very, obviously, I've lived as a minority except for the brief time I lived at Calvin College. I've lived as a minority in pretty much every community that I've lived in. In Peterson, the church where we lived and worked in a Black community. I was an overseas missionary in the Dominican Republic. White privilege was often paying more for things there. And then here in Sacramento, California, live in a neighborhood for which when I moved in was majority Black. There's a lot of movement, but in this area of town, there's no majority population. Racially, it's quite diverse. But I began to watch this stuff come up, and my attention was, if you say to young people that a specific demographic group is the sole source of all your problems, and you continue to reinforce this, you are going to sow a real problem down the line, the likes of which has been perpetrated repeatedly throughout history, because it's a very easy thing to blame some other group for your problems and misfortunes, and to and in fact, it may be the case that these other people are responsible for your problems and misfortune, but adopting a posture of a victim is not going to help you, and now obviously I see that the political agenda is towards some sort of revolution, but the difficulty that these would-be revolutionaries have is they're never going to be able to construct a positive agenda, because, and I think as you laid this out, this is a wholly reactive agenda, because they cannot necessarily embody justice. They can only point out injustice, and it's a very intuitive individual test. And do I feel oppressed? Yes. Therefore, injustice, and then you trigger the narrative. I don't know. Does that sound? I don't know if
the funny. Well, this is why it's so interesting to really dig into the theory, because it makes things make much more sense. So here are a couple of things I would say. You say, well, it's all about, do you feel oppressed? But it's not. So despite the fact that contemporary critical theory would be all about, lived experience. People's lived experience, you don't invalidate them. They have authority, speak from their lived experience. Remember Cory Booker talked about, thank you for sharing your truth. Or, it's all about. But here's an interesting thing. Do you ever wonder why, when a white rich white male says, I feel victimized, people just laugh at him and like, oh, give me a break, well, you blah, 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 you know. But wait a minute, you just talked about how lived experience is incontrovertible and it's sacred. But so why is his lived experience not? And the answer is because of the asymmetry, because of the social binary, because the assumption is that some groups, the dominant groups are these groups and the subordinate groups are these. And so lived experience and that the dominant groups are objectively blinded or tend to be by their privilege, and the subordinate groups objectively tend to be cited. And so when a white man feels oppressed, then a critical theorist will just tell him that's false. Objectively, you are not oppressed. But why? Because a priori, white males are not oppressed. And interestingly, my friend Pat, he is an academic and presents on these kind of topics at conferences. He's actually doing this in academia, but he actually just presented a paper on how white supremacist groups actually use lived experience in this way. They will say to a poor white person, don't you feel victimized? Aren't you constantly told white people have a problem? And they will prey upon poor working class whites and foment this dissatisfaction, this sense of victimhood, and they will appeal to lived experience. So his point is in a subtle way pointing out that epistemology is dangerous. But it's not just, and you can't just get around it by saying, well, a priori you're not oppressed. Well, says who? You have to appeal to some objective reality to say whether a group or a person is actually oppressed, and their feelings just aren't going to do the work. That your feelings don't carry the kind of authority you need to say they are actually oppressed. But it explains why. My point is just this: it explains why you'll hear lots of talk about lived experience, except when it's a lived experience of an oppressor person. The last thing, as I say, is that for all the talk of lived experience, the funny thing is, what happens when a woman or a person of color shares their lived experience, which goes against the narrative?
Right.
So a black conservative, say, or a female conservative, or a feminist like Christina Hoff Sommers, who's a feminist but is completely rejects that whole feminist narrative. Well, she's a self-identified feminist. They would disown her. But what happens then? The response is you have what's called internalized oppression. So your lived experience doesn't count because you are showing that you are still partaking in this the supremacy of whiteness and maleness. You've been so immersed in this hegemonic discourse of the ruling class that you've basically been brainwashed. And so you say you've never experienced racism, sexism, whatever, but you're just, either you're in denial or you're just blind to it because again, you're not woke yet. So so this is why it's so funny. Again, so once you understand the theory, I'm just saying theoretically, this is how they explain it.
Right.
It's such explanatory power. Don't you ever wonder why you'll have, and I don't pick on a race per se, but don't you ever wonder why you'll find like progressive white men talking down to black women, conservative, like about how they are wrong about race?
Yeah, I know.
I've seen like white progressive like calling black conservative names and saying like you just don't get race. I'm thinking like, what happened to lived experience? What happened to like and once you understand the theory, it makes sense because the white progressive is woke to reality, right? And or the male progressive or the male feminist, they are woke, and then they're trying to. My friend Elisa Childers was saying that she had a whole conversation with men on Twitter when she was saying something pro-life, and they were discussing with her present how they should refer to her. They said along she has internalized misogyny because she's pro-life. So here are two men who are pro-choice telling a woman who is pro-life why she is talking to her and saying this is why she's experiencing Stockholm syndrome. So it's just which for me as a scientist, I place a lot of value in explanatory power, predictive power. If I have a theory that can explain otherwise inexplicable phenomena, like how on earth you get men saying women's voices are so important, and then shutting up women who speak with their voices, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What happened? Well, it makes sense because what they want, actually, then there's a congresswoman, was it Presley, who recently talked
Yeah,
about,
yeah, 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 yeah.
remember she said, we
Yes,
don't need Muslims who don't want to speak with a Muslim voice.
right.
What does that mean?
Yes.
It makes sense now because actually in Kafi Kumasi in Beyond Critique has a chapter on critical race theory, and the concept of a voice is one of the key concepts of critical race theory. Voice says that the voices of the oppressed people, they speak with their voice, that's a key concept because they have authority, and it's critical to hear their voices to understand
right.
racial oppression. But you can be a black woman speaking without a black voice because
Right.
you have internalized. So the point, again, I know it sounds, I don't want to come across as, this, Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, it's not my concern. I'm just trying to explain why it's internally consistent. Once you understand the theory, all these practices, this behavior, it makes sense. I'm not trying to justify it, I'm not trying to condemn it. I'm just saying it fits with the theory.
No, I watched that clip and I saw that.
Yeah.
And I even used it in a sermon, and I think I confused some people because the problem is that unless you understand what she's saying, that black is no longer actually something that connects to, let's say, even skin pigmentation, or even, I mean, it's finally a confession. And I use that word theologically. It's finally a theological confession. And that's where I saw this, and I began to see this is an entire religion. This is an entire worldview.
Yeah. Have you seen the pieces coming out? There have been several of them recently on Pete Buttigieg and how he's not really homosexual.
Yes.
Like he's what's called performative. I have to look at the term they use. It's performativity. But the point is he's performing heterosexuality, even though he's a gay man married to another man. Right? So that. I don't understand how you can look at a man who's in a same-sex marriage and say he's not homosexual, but it does make sense if you understand the theory, is that he is embodying the values and norms of heterosexual normativity, right? He has the white picket fence and whatever, and so that is enough to say that he is not embodying the subversive norms that he ought to be embodying as a member of an oppressed subordinate group. So, I'm saying is it just, even if you think I'm a terrible bigot and this is all garbage, isn't it just interesting? If I were a total secularist progressive, I would just find it to have good explanatory power. Suddenly things would come into focus more. Like, this is what I believe. Now I understand why I believe these things. I'm not even critiquing it. I'm just saying it fits. It's like a puzzle. It fits together suddenly.
Yeah. Why do you think this is? I talked. I don't know if you've seen it. I had a conversation with James Lindsay on my channel a long time ago. Because he had made a comment about something that struck me interesting. So we had a conversation, and oh shoot, where was I going with this?
Talking about
why do you think? Well, then he put something on Twitter yesterday, and I made a comment to him, which I basically said, because I had a conversation with him, and what I didn't know before my conversation with him was the rise of atheism, or the rise of new atheism. And, Scott Alexander thinks about 2006, it really got going. And then what happened, with the whole elevator gate and all of that, where atheism plus, basically there's a split in the Church of Atheism between, and so you've got Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, and they're and Helen Pluckrose, they're sort of the vanguard of modernistic traditional new atheists, if we can call them traditional new atheists, on one end, who evidence-based theory, and they're concerned about the destruction of science and all that. And then the other side, which again, I don't know. Did you read Scott Alexander's piece on
I
Um,
may have. I think I've read some pieces like that, like describing the split in atheism. Yeah.
yeah. Well, the irony that I found was that, Sam Harris, Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins are, of course, on the old side of the split because,
Yeah.
status tends to do that. You'll tend to get stuck in your tribe. So it occurred to me, this new this new amalgam, whatever we can call it, seems to me to will likely be far more effective at de-churching people than the God delusion and new atheists efforts ever could be.
I don't think it's going to de-church anyone. Actually, I think
Really?
no. I think although I've seen, like I said, I've seen people that have become atheists. Um, what I've seen more personally is people will simply find progressive churches. Now, of course, progressive churches eventually die, which is historically what happens, like ineluctably. But in the short term, people don't just become atheists; they just begin to find their way into more and more progressive churches that will because and frankly because they have gradually embraced a new worldview, and so they need to find a new church that will be consonant with their new beliefs. Um, so I think, yeah, I think I see a far greater number of ex-evangelicals who are now. I mean, obviously, evangelicals are not the only Christians. But I'm just saying, talking about theological conservatism versus theological liberalism. They're finding their way into theological liberal churches that are in many cases like very borderline, whether you could even call them churches anymore. I mean, there's some, Unitarians are not Christian churches at all. Like, and growingly, I think you're seeing people going that direction.
Well, when you begin to, I mean, as you follow the logic of this worldview down, I mean, you really don't need a God.
No, 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 you don't. But remember, there's an entire tradition of liberation theology,
Yeah.
which many churches embrace, which is out there. And so, if people are trying to find a church that fits their worldview, their new worldview, they're plenty. So, yeah, I don't think that's, and of course, the other side of that is those churches are disappearing because, like you said, they don't need a God in the long run. But in the short run, in 10 or 20 years, people just find the local Episcopal church and join it because they talk about justice constantly. They talk about social justice and environmental justice, and so you'll be very comfortable there. And they and again, what I think, it's all, this is speculative, so take it with a grain of salt. I think what happens is you have evangelicals with conservative beliefs, but then who also begin embracing this language of social justice but really critical theory, and then they feel uncomfortable in their conservative evangelical churches, rightly or wrongly, but they can't quite fit in. But then they join a much more liberal church, then even they are comfortable with theologically, but because they now find solidarity politically or in terms of these other ideas, I think what happens is that actually they end up, their theological beliefs are now being driven by their political beliefs. Or or put it this way, their theological beliefs about things like the gospel, Jesus, God, those beliefs are being driven by their beliefs about, say, what we would say are not secondary, but the consequence of the gospel. So they've reprioritized. So whereas we would say that theology is the bedrock on which orthodoxy is the basis for orthopraxy and orthopathy, right? They've flipped that now. So now they have what they would say was orthopathy and orthopraxy, justice and caring about the oppressed here, and then those beliefs are dragging along the theology. So they follow their way into the local Episcopal church because there they can find people who care about justice, and there they're going to find people that feel a certain way, and then their theological beliefs maybe don't match that church's, but gradually get dragged along. Actually, my friend George Yancey is a sociologist, and he has been studying as an academic progressive evangelical churches, And his conclusion, based on sociology, not on theology, he's not saying this as a Christian, he's an evangelical, but he says that conservative evangelicals sociologically find their unity around theology, whereas progressive evangelicals, they find their unity around politics.
Right.
That's just sociologically, that's what he's found.
Right.
And so I think that's what's happening, is that what happens is that people are being pulled along into these churches that are, and it is also both the symptom of and the cause of their further drift from, I think, orthodoxy.
See, I think that's true. And I also think that in some ways, certain kinds of evangelicals are in fact more susceptible to this, because part of what has been happening for a long time is that the more Gnostic an evangelical tradition gets, the more free space in a sense you have in this frame. And so you can be very woke. You can be very woke while you're alive, and you have heaven to go. But I think you have heaven after you die. But I suspect that the wokeness will continue to, in other words, well, this gets into a lot of my stuff, which is a little afield of this. But in other words, for example, I was just reading. I'm working on John chapter 4, the woman at the well, for my adult Sunday school class. One of the things that I thought a lot about in college, when I grew up as a Christian, I went to college and thought, well, if I want to stop being a Christian, I can stop being a Christian now. And so I want to think about this thing, so I start reading the Bible and I start reading the Gospels, and I begin to notice that the kinds of things I see Jesus saying in the Gospels are very different from the kinds of things I hear in churches. And I begin to think, well, why is this? And so if you look at, say, Jesus and the woman at the well, the story really isn't about Jesus trying to make sure that this woman goes to heaven when she dies. I mean, that framework, you can get to that framework from John 4, but the Gospel of John is dealing with a lot of very interesting frameworks all the way through. Mm. And so then it's like, well, what then is the relationship between this world and the next? Mm. And if a number of evangelical churches have a number of evangelical traditions, and evangelicalism is, in my opinion, not so much a theological tradition as a sort of a marketplace. They're definitely, if you look at the Bebington Four, I mean, that's perhaps a theological way to look at it, but it strikes me that this particular wave is probably going to it's taken a lot of the mainline church already, at least the dominant voices in the mainline church. If you drive down past a church in Sacramento, it's very clear to see what side a church is on, because if they're an affirming church, you can't miss it by driving by, because they got signs and banners and they got everything. I mean, it's like some bizarro Billy Graham thing where you've got Billy Graham coming, except it's rainbow flags. Yeah. So, I think as this thing goes through, we're going to see a lot of the theological poverty of a tradition exposed by the fact that the church doesn't quite know what to say to people about, okay, so what does Jesus, what are you supposed to do before you die if this is about hell avoidance? And I don't know. There's just way too random thoughts for this conversation. You don't watch my stuff, nor necessarily should you. But anyway, I've bothered you for about an hour and 45 minutes now, pestering you with my questions. It's only fair to give you a chance to, if there's anything you want to say or any questions you want to ask me, or anything any place you would have liked to have seen this conversation go that it hasn't gone.
I think I always like to say in my talks, I always make sure to include a section on race and racism, because I think that that is frankly the way that the vast majority of evangelicals are being drawn into these ideas, is through, I think, a rightful shame and just burden for racial reconciliation. They want to see, they hate racism, or they feel probably not guilty for it. I think I became an evangelical Christian 20 years ago, and all the evangelicals I've ever known personally are just incredibly gracious, kind, loving people. And so I don't think that many evangelicals are out there literally thinking like, I have to mortify my desire to hate black or white people. I don't think it's happening. I think they look at our history and they say, this is a disaster. They look at our current politics, look at Donald Trump and say, man, even if they voted for him, they say this is not a good guy. And they want to do something, and they see that black Christians are hurting, and they want to see healing, they want to see justice, they want to see. So then they're sort of casting around for solutions. And so what I always want to say to them is, you're not wrong to feel that way. You're not wrong to want to see racial reconciliation. You're not wrong to care about things like, millions of black men in prison. You're not wrong to care about huge wealth disparities. You're not wrong to look at slavery and lynching and just be horrified. You're not wrong to look at your church from 50, 60 years ago, probably had a lot of just out and out racists in it, right? There's a very good chance that that's true. So it's not wrong to, in the biblical sense, to look at the church of the past and say, we repudiate that. Like, we do not want to repeat the sins of our fathers. We do, there's no doubt that there were present Christians who participated in lynchings, right? So we are right to say, I want to look squarely at the past. I want to reject it utterly. I want to find a way for us to live in love and peace with one another. And George Yancey says, we can't control the past, but we can try to create a world in a church, specifically talking to Christians. We can create a church that we want our kids to live in. That's what it's about. It's not about like repenting for the things that you didn't even do. It's about what do we bequeath to our kids. So I always want to mention that and say, all of that stuff is good and right. I'm no way trying to get you to stop talking about race and stop talking about these. But also, in addition to saying that, I want to just caution you that people telling you that critical race theory and critical theory broadly, it's the way, it's going to lead you to the promised land. That is not true. And in fact, it's the opposite, that critical race theory is, if anything, creating more and more tension and anger and mistrust and suspicion because of the way it conceptualizes race and gender and sexuality and a host of other things. So there's sort of two factions. There's like the woke faction and the anti-social justice warrior faction. Like these, like the blue team and the red team. And it's happening in the church. And people on the frankly, people on the red team, they love my work. They love the fact that I trying to dismantle critical theory. But I definitely don't want to make this about the tribe that we're in. I want to make it about the Bible. And I'm just trying to point out that what we're embracing and we're seeing in their culture is deeply corrosive of the Christian faith. And so you do not have to embrace wokeness to care about racism and to repudiate it and to work for racial healing. You do not need to go there. In fact, if you go there, it'll make it worse for you in many ways. That's what I always want to add that in my talks and interviews.
Well, my problem is that, so when I grew up in the 60s and 70s, a big part of the response to white blindness as to what it's like to be an African American, a big response to that was live with people. And so in the Northside Chapel, the church that my father helped start, I mean, a big part of that church was a church which was multi-ethnic. It was black and white, and that's what multi-ethnic meant. Although there were a few other folks from other groups, but basically American conversations were black and white.
Yeah, right.
And my fear now is that this one term, similar to what you said about white privilege, that the terminology has now been so completely co-opted that I don't have other words.
Yeah.
and I, it's, and I think, part of what I've seen in, and I don't know this in detail, but part of what I suspect and fear is that the offices and organs that had been put in place in the 60s and 70s to help churches deal with the continual problem of racism. And it's important that people not, first of all, defining racism itself is not an easy thing.
Yeah, right.
And that's a whole nother conversation. And it is important to not imagine that somehow in America today that you can't, that there aren't many, many people who continue to harbor, old racist patterns of thinkings and biases and continue to act on them consciously and overtly today.
Sure.
I know way too much to imagine that doesn't happen.
Right.
And that part of what happened in the 60s and 70s is that a lot of those people, in a sense, went into the closet and were socialized to learn to not let anybody know what they really think about other racial groups. And it is often only, usually when you're, and sort of like middle class and upper class people especially have been deeply socialized into this. And it's much more often at the lower socioeconomic reaches of society that you'll see people with less to lose just, in fact, say what they think.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
But to imagine that this doesn't go up is just being naive. But I fear that much of the good work that was laid in the 60s and 70s has simply gone this way rather reflectively, or sort of on the way there. Because when I listen carefully to the language, and we have the same problem with the white, white privilege language that you use.
Yeah.
The language is all sort of lining up, and then this particular group of people are now the prophets, the pioneers, the people who see more deeply than say others that were writing before the 90s, let's say. And it's interesting to me because I recently read a really fine, actually an award-winning biography of Malcolm X. And many of these same issues are very much at play as were at play in the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
And so, my concern is that for people who are suspicious of this new hermeneutic, let's call it, to borrow an old phrase from an old battle, people who are suspicious of this new worldview, it's really difficult for them to find a lane.
Yeah.
And for them to find each other, because in a sense, much of the language has simply been appropriated by this particular group. And so now they're left without a language.
Right.
And we're in the kind of culture war where you have the dynamic that if you don't line up with, it's basically culture gang warfare. If you don't line up with this gang, you're presumed to be part of that gang.
Right.
And which makes Barack Obama a white supremacist president, because you follow this language and you begin to say, we're just living in crazy town here. Barack Obama is a white supremacist president. That's just nuts. But
well, it makes sense if you understand the theory, right?
That's right. It makes sense if you understand the theory. So I've got deep concerns about this and I think long run, I don't see this house as being able to finally stand But I think in the long run, I fear that those it pretends to support will actually be the losers in the long run
Yeah,
of these efforts.
I don't take the sort of long-term culture shaping view I think that some Christians take, which is not wrong, but I'm more focused on the individuals because this I think that the sort of wokeness fad, it will burn out. I think it's a fad. I think it will burn out one day. I mean, we go through periods like the 60s, 70s, right? There are these revolutionary periods that just happen. They do burn out eventually, God willing, but they're casualties. That's the thing. Like, you say, well, then why worry about it? Because in 20 years, everyone will sort of forgotten wokeness. Okay, oh, maybe, but there will be real souls lost because of embracing these totally unbiblical ideologies. And so, I think the solution that I've come up with in terms of what I do is that when I give these kind of talks, I try to show people that there's another way, right? Which is, I think, the biblical approach is that you can reject wokeness and critical theory and still reject sort of the red tribe, totally unconcerned with racism, whatever. What are the caricatures? I don't find, frankly, again, personally speaking, I don't know any Christians, I don't know any evangelical Christians who just don't care about racism. Just like, yeah, I don't care. Yeah, racism is okay. No,
I
no one
do.
does that. What's that? Yeah, but okay. I said this is my lived experience here. I'm speaking
Right.
from lived experience. I'm just saying, and actually, that's a good point though. I think a lot of it's contextual. I think that I've been an evangelical Christian in very cosmopolitan areas.
Mm.
Well, the irony is that the wokest places on earth, and in the U.S., that's where the churches are going woke and decrying racism, and where they need at least. They need to be warned about the dangers of wokeness. Whereas in the churches out in the deep south that are maybe nominally full of nominal Christians and cultural Christians who probably do harbor a lot more racism than they do in the cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic cities, in those, say, rural areas, I'm stereotyping, I understand, but in the areas where you have this huge amounts of maybe unconverted nominal Christians who probably do harbor a lot more racism, just culturally speaking, they're the big bugaboo is wokeness, and you have what C.S. Lewis talked about. You have people both running to the sinking side of the ship. Like, you have these people running when the ship's about to sink. They're all running to they're running out with fire extinguishers. When the ship's on fire, they're all jumping into they're pouring more fuel on it. So what I think we need to do is the people that least need wokeness are embracing it. The people that most need wokeness are rejecting it. I think we should look at our own congregations, each of us, and say, what does our church need? And for example, I met a friend in New Orleans who's a pastor. I think he's Puerto Rican by birth, but he's adopted. But he was, very conservative guy. He's a wonderful believer. We got talking after my talk on critical theory, and in that talk I'd shared that some of the data, all the data shows that about 16% of whites are against interracial marriage. That's numerous surveys, and that one of the surveys showed that 28% of white Republicans, 28% think that interracial marriage is immoral. And that, to me, I was just like, what on earth? Like, I'm half Indian. Like, I don't know a single person, that would. Well, I know one evangelical Christian who's opposed to interracial marriage, and he's not white. But everybody, so everybody else, I'm like, this is off the. But after the talk, this guy Tim came up to me and was like, he ministers in a rural Arkansas town, like 3,000 people. He's like, oh, around where I live, probably 50%.
Yeah.
And so the point is just that what is unthinkable to me is completely normal to him. Yeah. And of course, he doesn't. But my point is that, like, I think that we have to get wiser about how we contextualize these ideas to our congregation. I do not think that a pastor in the middle of Manhattan needs to be preaching against racism every Sunday. Probably not. In fact, he probably needs to be preaching against things like LGBTQ affirmation, right? Because that's a really cutting edge, dangerous, triggering issue that the church needs to hear biblical truth on. Whereas the really radical sermon on racism needs to be preached in southern, wherever, rural Arkansas, where there is much more racism, and they need to talk about it. So my point is just that be wary of preaching against sins that no one really deals with, and praising virtues that everyone already accepts. we should kind of do the opposite, right? So that's my thought.
Well, we've gone for a while, and again, I do want to give you a chance. Anything else you want to say, or any questions you have for me? But I really appreciate you giving me your time. I have just trying to schedule this gave me a picture and just how and your priorities are correct. You will have your children will be young for a very short amount of time, and pour your life into them, because it's a special, wonderful privilege to raise children and to love them and to be with them. So
Let me say one more thing. I always do this too. Probably most of the people that listen to your channel are Christians. Probably most are. But if you're not a Christian,
not my channel.
Great, wwonderful. What I would say is, I understand if you hear me talking about critical theory and you write me off, and probably Paul too as well, but you write us off as these terrible, bigoted hate mongers. You're conservative, right-wing, Fox News, Sean Hannity, MAGA, Make America Great. That's understandable, right? And so you hear us talk about LGBTQ issues and think how hateful we are, or race, and not embracing wokeness, and we must be bigots in our hearts. I just want to say that for non-Christians, set aside all of those issues and focus on, again, Jesus himself, all right? Because all of the things we're talking about right now in this podcast, all of them are downstream of Jesus, right? If you'd shown me my current beliefs about all kinds of issues, right? You'd shown me that 23 years ago, I would have been aghast, right? And so why did I change? And the answer is because I realized that, man, what if Jesus is actually who he claimed to be? And that thought then leads to other thoughts like, oh my gosh, what if the Bible's true and I am a sinner who needs rescue? And if that's true and the Bible's true, that's going to totally reorient my worldview. And it's not going to, I hope we don't come across as hateful, evil bigots. Maybe we do, I don't know. But I just want to emphasize that when God changes you and converts you and you trust in Jesus, it shouldn't turn you into a hateful, evil person. Because why? Because you realize you are a hateful, evil person.
You're already one.
Right. That's the crazy, crazy paradox of the gospel, is that it's in realizing just how wicked and hateful we are, and that we've received mercy from God, that makes us humble and loving. And it's a reason why, but funny irony, before I was a Christian, I totally looked down, not on, people of color or blacks or women, but on other people. Definitely. People that were not as smart as me, people that were not as moral as me. I was totally not woke, but I was progressive and liberal in the sense of being like, but I had that horrible seed of pride and hatred in my heart that in God's eyes is just as bad as all these other, non-woke sins. So when I became a Christian is when I realized that actually all those things are equally bad. That being woke is not the only thing that God desires. God wants you to care about not just oppressed groups, but about purity and holiness and humility. And so all I'm saying is that if you hear one thing, hear that the gospel of Jesus rescuing sinners is what transforms people. And if you hate all of my views on these things, don't think about them. Think about what is Jesus actually saying, and is it true? That's what I'd leave everyone with.
Okay. Well, thank you, Neil. Maybe if we ever talk again, we'll talk about how, and speaking as a Calvinist, how when I started this thing started, I decided I need to learn the rules of this new religion. So I decided to read Everyday Feminism every day, which is the blog.
Oh, yeah, yeah, sure.
I started reading it every day.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, this is a burden of the law, like the Apostle Paul talks about. Yeah. And anyway, thank you so much, Neil. Thank you for your heart. And what I really appreciate about what you're doing is you're reading all these books and you're blogging, and you save me a ton of time. And I actually I follow your blog fairly closely, because people will, when I'll when I'll talk about this stuff, again, I didn't have any of this language before. I was just saying something weird is going on.
Yeah.
You're reading the books and distilling it, and I, you know, I think I think you're trying to be fair in terms of your reading of this to say what it is. And I
Yeah.
appreciate your efforts, and I appreciate the clarity with which you have broken this stuff down. And I think you're doing a real service. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul.
All right. Well, you have a good evening. What's left of it.
All right. Good night.
Good night.